Beginning on July 6, 1975, Mount Pleasant, Ontario tobacco farmer Joe Borda would find himself caught up in things out of his scope of reason. What started as a sighting of a domed object across the field of rye on his mother's farm would touch off a domino effect of bizarre occurrences and strange events, one that would forever link the modest Canadian tobacco farmer to the world of the paranormal. While working on his mother's tobacco farm one Sunday afternoon, Borda, who was crossing from the house to the barn, spotted something bizarre sitting in the tobacco field beyond the rows of rye. It was shiny, domed, and metallic. A flying saucer. That's a flying saucer, Borda told himself. Borda quickly came to his senses and dismissed it as a tank truck spraying the field. Wandering into the barn, he dismissed it from his mind. Later, while talking to investigators, Borda admitted that he knew it wasn't a tank truck and wasn't sure what caused him to think otherwise. Author and investigator Graham Conway likened it to Borda having his thoughts rearranged. Borda noted that no tank truck had driven past his house to go into the field, and there's no way it could have reached it without damaging the irrigation pipes, which were 10 inches in diameter and littered around that area. As well, who would have sprayed his field? Certainly not Borda, and his neighbor, who was deeply religious, never worked on Sunday, so who? 2 days after the sighting, Borda, who had forgotten about the incident, went into the tobacco field with a cultivator to begin work. He began to feel sick, and by 11 a.m. that Tuesday morning, he decided to quit and returned home. Borda's wife was surprised as he never came home before noon, and he acknowledged to her that he didn't feel well. After a couple of hours and a healthy lunch, he decided to return to work. At around 1:30, Borda, while working in his field, came upon a circular crust patch of tobacco plants about 30 to 40 feet in diameter. It looked as if a heavy weight had been placed upon them. He quickly realized that this was where he had observed the object 2 days earlier. Peering across the field, he could see the barn about a third of a mile away where he had been standing that day. He looked around and found no tracks to support his original tank truck idea. However, on the ground within the circle were 2 spots of some substance, reddish-purple in color, that felt slippery and oily, but not sticky. These patches were about as big as a fist, and the strange material seemingly had penetrated the ground several inches. While deciding what to do on the matter, something truly bizarre happened. Even though he had told no one of the sighting and of the circular formation of crushed crops, it seems somebody else was aware of it. Arriving mere hours later was a limousine with Arizona license plates, which arrived at his farm and drove directly to the damaged area without stopping to get permission. Surprised and curious of why they were on his property, Borda followed the limousine and its 3 occupants to the site, where he found them gathering samples. When he asked what they were doing, the men informed him that they were gathering samples and that he was to return to work, and it was none of his business. For some reason, which Borda could not explain, he immediately complied with their order. He left without argument. Investigators looking into the case were puzzled by the fact that Borda had not demanded identification from the 3 men or ordered them off his property until the police had been notified. What bothered them the most was how the 3 strangers knew about the UFO event, as Borda had not reported it to anyone. Who were these men, and why had they driven all the way from Arizona just to gather some samples? After this incident, Borda decided to call his brother Charles, who was a Crown attorney for Brant County. He was looking for advice regarding the matter. Charles arrived, and with Joe, the pair decided to call the provincial police at Brantford. Officers arrived on the scene and checked for vandalism and removed soil samples that were sent to the Attorney General's laboratory in Toronto for analysis. Borda failed to hear back from them for some time, and in a desperate bid to get some answers to the strange events occurring on his farm, he turned to a local UFO group. 3 days later, a trio of investigators arrived on the scene. One was a Canadian living in Niagara Falls, Ontario, while the other 2 were Americans, one from Niagara Falls and the other from Buffalo, New York. At around 7 p.m., they asked if they would be permitted to visit the site for themselves. Eager to get answers, Borda drove them to the landing area. It was a clear, calm night as the 4 stood at the site and discussed the events of July 6th. As they were speaking, one of the men piped up, wondering who had a transistor radio going. Although a fair amount of equipment had been brought along, a radio was not amongst the items. All stopped to listen, but could hear nothing. Just as they returned to talking of the event, the eerie voice transmission resumed. "Did you hear that?" one of the men asked. This time, they all did. This startled Joe. "I'll never forget it as long as I live," he told Conway. He described the voice as sounding female and speaking in a language that was, to all those present, unrecognizable. It was low in volume, crystal clear in quality, flawless and flowing. It was almost like a data reading. In Borda's opinion, it wasn't of this world.
Charlie, Sierra, Kilo, Charlie, Mike, Whiskey, Juliet, Whiskey, Lima, Sierra.
After about 3 minutes of this, Borda got an uneasy feeling, a sense that he should return to his house immediately. Although Borda insisted that he wasn't scared, he told the investigators, "I'm not staying here anymore." He turned and he walked away. The Canadian investigator followed him to the car. 2 Americans stayed behind to investigate further. As soon as Borda shut the door and indicated he was going to leave, the other 2 came running. They were waving and begging not to be left out there. Inside the car, the Americans admitted that they had seen a branch move in the bushes alongside the field, about 150 feet away from where the transmission appeared to originate. It appeared to them that someone or something had been in the bushes observing them the whole time, although Borda had not noticed any trespassers on his property, as anyone moving across the field would have been in plain view for several minutes. The 4 men sat up talking well into the night. All were convinced that something unusual had taken place, but they weren't able to offer a reasonable explanation, and none of the men were eager to return to the field that night, fearing what they might encounter. Given their seeming lack of interest in the goings-on on his property, Borda was reluctant to call the police over the matter. Douglas Lucas, director of the Forensic Science Center in Toronto, contacted Borda later, indicating that analysis of the sample sent to him, the one the police had asked him to check on, was comprised of tobacco and soil. It was not radioactive, and it did not contain oil. Staff Sergeant Bud Soroka, head of the Brantford's Police Department, recalled that the sample looked just like a sponge but felt somewhat firmer. Plants examined within the area showed that they contained a reddish-brown streak down the center. However, it could not be established if this was present beforehand. Members of the Northeastern UFO Organization, who had investigated the case, took samples and photographs of the area. It was found that the 20-foot area of damaged plants had a bluish tint not present in the undisturbed part of the field nearby. When the bluish-green substance was tested, it was found to contain sand and an oily silicone-based substance of unknown composition. While the Borda tobacco farm incident is relatively obscure, a blip that only those deeply immersed in the UFO subject matter seem to be aware of, it remains an important case nonetheless, one that cannot be dismissed easily.